All right, we're on. Malalele and welcome everyone to the Pasifika webinar series. Before we go into introducing our guests, we just want to share the mission and the vision for the Pasifika webinar series. We like to acknowledge that this is part of the University of Utah Pacific Island Studies Initiative Bridge Program, which is aiming to build a fertile mutualistic relationship between Pacific Islander communities and the University of Utah. This webinar series is a continuation of our Pacifica Scholars Institute, and it is bridging culture, community, and education through Talanoa, intending to amplify our Pacifica community's voices, as well as provide higher education resources at the University of Utah. For this Zoom webinar, it will be moderated by me, Mwana Uave, recorded and offered later on our YouTube channel, the Pacifica Archive. So make sure you subscribe and look up our Pacifica Archive on YouTube. A special thanks to Dr. Lani, our faculty advisor, Kalei Tutupo, and Kaimana Kahale for bringing this webinar into all of our living rooms this evening. A few housekeeping items before we jump right in. So for this Zoom, we're going to spend about 40 minutes talking to our guests and then move into a Q&A. So if you all will look at your screens as attendees, if you have any questions that you would like to pose to the panelists, please feel free to type in any of those questions, and then we will have Q&A, the last portion of this of our webinar, and then we'll take as many as we can. So I want to thank our guests for being here today. And before I do that, I just wanted to acknowledge from our last webinar, Margarita Satini. A huge portion of the reason why we decided to do this webinar with our guests was because 2 Fridays ago, we had the opportunity to listen and talk about voting in the time of Corona with Margarita Satini. And shortly after that, she passed away due to COVID complications. And I just want to take a moment to acknowledge the amazing work that she was able to do, and remind everybody as we're out there doing the good work, fighting the good fight, to make sure to thank people while they're still here with us, and acknowledge all the labor that they provide for our community. And so hopefully those of you who are dealing with tough times, I know it's a very stressful time, our webinar can somewhat help navigate you through that. So thank you all for participating. And without further ado, I just want to introduce both of our panelists. So our first guest is Dr. Ofa Hafoka Kanuch. She's a Tongan American assistant professor, licensed clinical psychologist, and researcher at Brigham Young University. She has a doctoral degree in counseling psychology from BYU. Ofa's clinical work is geared toward individuals with a wide range of psychological issues, including but not limited to anxiety, depression, marital and relationship issues, trauma, post-traumatic stress disorder, ethnic and minority issues. Ofa has experience co-leading several groups for eating disorders, reconciling faith and sexuality, anxiety, sexual trauma, and multicultural issues. In addition to her work with the college and university population, she has worked in various private settings as well as community mental health settings. Ofa teaches several college courses. Her dissertation focused on examining the utilization rates and presenting concerns of Pacific Islander and Asian American students. She hopes to replicate her research on these populations in college counseling centers across the country. She's an advocate for breaking the stigma around mental health illness and seeking therapy in Pacific community. Welcome, Ofa. Our second guest today is Dr. Lani Taholo. She's the clinical director, PhD, and licensed social worker and owner of, um, with her husband, Ben Taholo, of the Child and Family Empowerment Services, an outpatient mental health clinic. Dr. Taholo is of Tongan, Hawaiian, Chinese, and Norwegian descent. She has a doctorate degree of social work from the University of Utah. She's the second Pacific Islander to graduate from the social work PhD program and the first Pacific Islander to graduate from this program as a licensed clinical social worker. What this means is that she was the first Pacific Islander from the program to tackle mental health among Pacific Islanders for her dissertation. Lani has served as the clinical director for Child and Family Empowerment Services for the last 17 and a half years. Her passion is to serve families that have suffered trauma and diverse backgrounds. Her dissertation includes Kaimana, a curriculum she created to address trauma among Pacific Islanders, and the Kaimana group is currently running under their agency at this time. Lani comes from a philosophy of empowerment and diversity. She has worked with children, youth, and families who have suffered from trauma over the last 38 years. So welcome, Lani, to today. Um, we're so we're so privileged to have both of you here today, especially being the busy people that you are. I just wanted to thank both of you for even taking out the time. I know you could be doing a lot of other things today on Friday night. Um, I don't know, partying or whatnot, right, Lani? So I just am grateful that you all were able to join us. So I wanted to just start out with the most pressing and important question that we ask all of our guests is, what is your favorite Pacifica artist or band?
Well, and I'd like to hear Ofa's too. I really love Nathan Aviao and Hui Ohana. I love Justin Young and Israel Breda is. Um, I like some of the Common Kings. We saw them in concert in Cali before, so
I love that, Lani.
yeah. So yes, I love all.
I agree. I love that whole list, Lani. I love Josh Tatofi most recently, and also the Tonga sisters.
Oh, yeah.
Yes. Yes.
So we're gonna curate a playlist with everybody's favorites and be like, this is from the Pacifica community in the in Utah, all their favorites. So those are some really good ones. So on more of a serious note, transitioning, I just wanted to talk about kind of both of you introducing yourselves. Of course, you read your bio, but you as people, and the biggest thing for me was. How have you or what was it like the deciding factor for both of you to go into mental health? We'll start with Ofa and then we'll move to Lani.
So my dad, I grew up with my dad as a school counselor. He was elementary school counselor and then high school. And I watched him change the lives of a lot of a lot of Polynesian, Tongan high school students and help them to graduate. From there, I thought that I would be interested in counseling, but I knew that I was not meant for high school counseling. I don't have that kind of patience like my dad does. But that's what sparked my interest in mental health. Was watching him do the work that he does and be really good and excel in it. And then later on, when I got older and when I was in college, I was able to study and focus on counseling, which is more general. I feel like I'm trying to just take a more general approach because I can work with kids, but just not feel the pressure to help them graduate with high school like my dad did. But that's at least where I think I started to be interested in mental health through my dad.
Wonderful. My grandmother raised us. Anaseni Takipo Tamoepeau Katoa. And I just, mom and dad were busy working just like any other Polynesian family where you've got kids at home and, all the adults are working multiple jobs. And we had moved from Hawaii over to San Francisco Bay Area is where a lot of us grew up. And um, we, having grandmother there, um, she raised us in a strict Tongan way. But before she came out, um, and dad had landed a job at Pan American, worked with a lot of the OGs, right, from San Francisco Bay Area and the Polynesian community there. And this was in the 60s, yeah. So early 60s. And uh, we had moved into San Jose, and I was on my tricycle. I remember I was around 4, and I was abused by some neighborhood boys. I didn't know how to articulate what I experienced and went through, but I just remember hiding under beds after that. I I didn't know why. I just felt a compulsion to do that. And it wasn't until um, as I got a little older, and then grandma came to take care of us, that I knew that grandma was going to be there always. Like, she became like such a, we come home from school, she was cooking sekoni and making, like these jam rolls and everything. And that just allowed me somehow to begin to realize what had happened. And then I would see my grandma go out and bake things, and my mom would do the same thing, and my dad would help people with immigration. And I saw that movement in the early 60s, and then growing up in the Bay Area, it was just, and all that diversity, and then just that experience that I had had earlier where I couldn't articulate what happened. It just really, I was like, this is what I want to do. This is, I want to figure this out. I want to be able to express it, and somehow maybe along the way I could really seriously work on this, and then help others to figure out how to articulate their experiences and their own trauma. And it doesn't have to be something that, like, exactly what happened to me. It could be grief and loss. It could be, it's on a continuum, right? Works on a continuum. So I that's really what really drove that whole piece for me, um, from a pretty young age.
And both of
I
you
can
mentioned.
I can talk about it now. I couldn't talk about this several years ago. I couldn't even say the words, but I again, it's been 38 years, but at the beginning of the career it was like, yeah, you need to talk about this even more now. But yeah, that's how it came out.
So both of you mentioned your family's playing a huge role in going into this field, and then I just want to touch upon what Lani was talking about when you said um, that you couldn't talk about then, but you can talk about it now. How have you seen the mental health field just kind of transform, especially I would say in the last few years, and shifting and changing? Do you see that as a positive, in a positive direction? I see Ofa shaking her head. Maybe we'll talk to Ofa real quick about how that's shifting, and what are things that we should look out for or contribute to as Pacific Islanders. Oh,
Are you asking about this shift in our community?
yeah,
Just the way
just
that
like
people.
of people viewing mental health, and is it a positive direction, a negative direction? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I feel like in the past couple of years, and I don't know if it's just because I'm in the field, but I think that there's like a really big push in the generation now who have had to learn how to bridge being Tongan and being American, living in America. And I think there's a big push for just more understanding and education right now in mental health. And I remember right before I applied to grad school in my own community, there are about 3 young people who committed suicide. And it was really hard for people to talk about it without all that shame, and without like the guilt, and without taking on responsibility for what had happened. But I feel like now I can have a conversation, at least start a conversation with people in our community where the walls are not completely up, because they've heard kind of what mental health is, and I think there's just more acceptance right now. And this is a community effort, right? That as a community, I think we are starting the conversation, and we're starting to talk about mental illness, and we're almost to the point where we're okay. We can normalize just seeking help, seeking professional help right now. So I've seen a really big shift in a positive way when it comes to mental illness and just conceptualizing mental illness. And I will say that the first time I went to Tonga, I was, I think, 19 or 20, and I went through BYU Hawaii. And I remember that I remember trying to ask about how do you make sense of mental health here while I was working at Leohana. And the answer that I got there was just a lot of beliefs around superstition.
Mhm.
I completely understand why that's used to explain mental illness, and I think at the same time that's kind of used as a generalization in our community, right? That, oh no, it's just superstition, we don't talk about it. And I'm seeing like a really big shift in just making room for actual mental illness and seeking the proper help for that right now.
Yeah, totally. Lani, I see you shaking your head.
Yeah, I agree with everything that Alpha said, and I think definitely among the younger generation right now, we've seen an explosion over at our clinic in terms of younger, like even Pacific Islanders saying, calling in and just saying we want help.
Mhm.
And I would like to, you know, echo along with what Ofa's saying. And today, whoever's on this webinar, it's really important for us to be able to say it's absolutely appropriate and absolutely, you know, critical that you take care of you, that you are okay to acknowledge that you have needs, and that you could really use some guidance on how to navigate some of the difficulty that you may be experiencing. And what came out in the Kaimana dissertation was that on some of the outcome was that the Pacific Islanders stakeholders that we interviewed were saying, we don't call it mental health, we call it well-being. So we're used to, like, if we say, so how are you doing overall, and how are and this is the connection, how are you doing in your relationships, how are you doing with your family, how are you doing, how's your family doing, like that for a Pacific Islander is like everything, because we are all about our relationships. And so in that sense, what came out in the data was that people were able to relate to it in that way. They were like, yeah, if I'm having difficulty in my relationships, and now it's to the point where I'm having difficulty at school, I'm having difficulty at work, I can't even concentrate, and it's impacting the major roles that I play in life, and it's impacting my functioning. Yeah, you are actually experiencing some difficulties that where we can help you navigate through those issues. There's support out there. Ofa and them are all out. Ofa has a great team out there. That at BYU, we work out in Salt Lake. There are Pacific Islanders here that are in the field where we speak the same lingo in terms of our culture, and we understand what that's like. And then and then the dualism of being Pacific Islander and then living in a Western culture. Like, how do you mitigate those pieces? So yeah, so I'm seeing nothing but positive. Oh, we're always gonna have those that are like, mama tiny, fuck a hella money. We're always gonna have those. That just comes with the territory. But overall, there's been a big shift for sure in the last several years. So yeah.
What have you noticed were the main barriers in your own research and also just in your experience that are keeping folks, Pacifica folks, from coming in and getting help? For you
Um,
also like students, and for you, Lani, just community folks, since you run a community clinic.
Yeah, I was going to say I'd love to hear what Ofa has to say, and then I'd like to share a few of the factors that came out of the Kaimana study for that question. Yeah.
Hmm. You could go. You could go first, Lani.
Is that okay? Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks, sis.
You're such therapists. They want to listen to each other.
We do.
Yeah.
We want to hear what each other has to say. So what came out, some of the factors that came out in terms of obstacles was the change and the difficulty in transition regarding leadership. Many, I would say that was one of the most significant pieces that came out in terms of obstacles that that many of our people were saying, I'm having difficulty with my well-being, my overall well-being, because so and so has died here, and now I don't know who's going to take the place. And I had a relationship with that, my grandmother or my aunt or my uncle or my grandfather or my father or my mom, and there's no longer that patriarchal or matriarchal model of leadership. And when they pass away, it's interesting to see how the next generation acts without the leadership, a clear sense of leadership. That was loud and clear in the data, that our people were hungering for clear leadership that included our sense of identity culturally, and that we knew what the nuances were in terms of how we do tauhiva. So when we do tauhiva and we interact with each other appropriately, then they go, oh, they received the kaliloa at home where the parents lay their arms out and they explain to them the do's and the don'ts in the society, in the village. Yeah. But if they act out, they didn't really get the kaliloa, or they didn't listen, or they, they're being pau. But but it was totally like, wow, they don't know how to do tauhiva. So it's really important in the leadership to show by example, because cultural signs was in my dissertation. I count we because my husband was there for all my homework. So we, um, he got the degree just as much, and deserves it. And so I think that was huge. Also, the lack of relatability to the therapists. They would maybe go once to therapy and that was it. Like after that, it was, if several would express that I felt like I was repeating over and over, like explaining who I was as a Pacific Islander. And so like half of our sessions would take that time just explaining who I was before we could even get to the issues.
Like,
So
I didn't want to give myself therapy. I was going to give myself therapy.
so the reason why we have kaimana is so that you don't have to explain. You don't have to explain. The important thing was for kaimana was to do the homework ahead of time so that the curriculum is Pacific Islander, and you go in and you share your story. You don't have to explain to any therapist what that means. So again, those pieces and tauhiva, leadership, all of that. Yeah, those are obstacles if we don't, make sure that we're practicing those things. So those came out.
I love that, Lani. I completely agree that there's a need for that in our community, or else people won't seek help.
Yeah.
My dissertation was on the utilization rates in the College Counseling Center for Pacific Islanders and Asian Americans, and I found that over 17 years, because I needed 17 years to get a good sample size. So it was over 17 years that only 400 of Pacific Islanders and Asian Americans sought counseling, but that the utilization rates were not significantly different from white students. It was the prematurely termination of therapy. And so
Oh.
usually
Yeah.
Pacific Islanders, Asian Americans will go to 1 or 2 and then drop off, whereas most of the white students in my sample went to at least 8 sessions. And it's
Yeah.
usually 8 where you can see real change happen.
Mhm.
So I saw that once they, and I think this brings up like the second research question, right? Is why are they terminating after just 1 or 2? And I think there's a lot of reasons. And a big part of that is what Lani touched on. That if I'm a client and I'm going to a therapist who won't understand, then it's hard for me to open up because I'm spending my whole session educating them about my culture and not about the issue that I came in with.
Yes.
You're
yes.
like, I left with more issues than I came in with.
Exactly. Exactly. And I think everything Ofa said, and Margarita was such an advocate for speaking your voice. And so part of this whole movement to really move in a direction of speaking our truth and really using our voices, which is, oh my gosh, that is Margarita. Margarita embodied that. The power behind that as Pacific Islanders, as we finally rise to say, I am suffering from these things. Because the other piece that came out of the data, and I bet this will, that OFA, as we look and collaborate, look at this, is the other stats that came out in terms of Pacific Islanders had the lowest stats in terms of developing relationships with their doctors. So if anything, it would be a deathbed piece where they would end up showing up at the emergency room. And then in the data, and the stats would show that we had one of the highest in the country for not only coming to the emergency rooms, again, waiting. And a lot of that has to do with shame as well. Until the very end, and then I'm not being strong for my family to the very end. And then we would have the longest stays at the hospital subsequent to the emergency room. So these are all reflections, right? It's mirroring our experiences as Pacific Islanders, because what we would do, what it said in the literature, it all came out in the data, was that well, I'm going to go to my Faifakau before I even talk to my doctor about this stuff. And if I go to court and the judge says that I have to do this, I don't care what the judge says. I need to talk to my Faifakau first. I need to talk to. So this is the kind of stuff, the obstacles that we face in terms of well-being, right? So we're going off of what we understand. And so we're just trying to help broaden that understanding. So
I have a question to that. Then, how are you were mentioning this right before, Lani. How can you be your whole self? I feel like these are competing interests in some sense. Where how do I be my whole self and tauhiva and not piss off the Faifakau? Like, you know what I mean? Like these seem. What's interesting to me is all the things both of you named seem to be the things that hold the Pacifica people together, but also are the determining factors for why they have these mental health issues in the first place. I don't know.
No. And I mean, also, wouldn't you agree that that's the juxtaposition that we as Pacific Islanders face, right? We are in constant conflict with all of these pieces. That's where the shame comes in, right? And so much of what we deal with in the Kaimana group is really to look at ourselves with softer eyes, like be kinder to ourselves, and really take a look at divvying out between, what is our truth and then what is going on, and we can still hold on to our cultural pieces that we really love. But that is the conflict. Which pieces am I going to prioritize and keep? And especially if I'm married to a non-Pacific Islander and I'm doing the kavenga and they need $500 to pay for the funeral, but then we're not going to pay rent. This is exactly the conflict that we go through, and it impacts our well-being and our mental health. Yeah.
Mhm.
And I think this is why it's important to find a therapist who understands, right? Because I think in my
Yeah.
own training, I was taught to emphasize individualism, right? That you are your own person from your family, and that's really healthy. But to a Pacific Islander, it's not really healthy, right? Because it brings up, like, this is detrimental to their mental health because of the relationships that Lani was talking about earlier. And I think that we often, as a community, as a culture, we often forget the relationship with ourselves. And I think that's
Yes.
a really important piece for
Yeah.
Pacific Islanders to focus on in
Yes.
therapy, because we value all these other relationships, right? We define ourselves in terms of our relationships, but we forget that
Yeah.
important.
Yes. Yes. And exactly on Ofa's point, because one of the scenarios that we talk about in the Kaimana group is where a Pacific Islander girl has been told that she needs to go to her uncle's funeral. And you know how we feel about funerals, right? In our culture, that's like, you don't miss those. If you miss a wedding, okay, here and there, but funerals you don't miss, right? And of course we've got COVID and everything going on, so that, that I'll throw that in the mix. It's just super, super hard. But like, this same uncle was the one that sexually molested her while she was growing up. So
Mm.
part of her cultural dilemma is
Mm.
she is trying to protect her own virtue. That's huge in our culture. And at the same time, she's trying to be in compliance with her mom and dad that are like, you have to go to this funeral. You're the oldest in the family and you're setting the example for the rest of your brothers and sisters. I mean, there are layers and layers and layers of pieces that we don't even realize as Pacific Islanders, because we go through it almost on a daily basis, that we go, oh, okay, I guess I'll just go. But then if she goes and if she's there, what is going on inside of her to where she's re-triggered, right? She gets triggered again. The trauma comes back, the flashbacks. I mean, this is very real for our people, because this is stuff typically that we don't talk about. You keep it at home. You don't go out and tell everybody else, outside the home. And so many, like, even what also came out in the data was that some of the families were admitting that they knew of some other families, they weren't saying it was theirs, but knew of others that were not being forthright about a youth having suicidal thoughts because they were fakama. They were so embarrassed to say, or even to, like, their faifekao, to the patele, right, to the priest or the bishop or their ecclesiastical leader. They're having thoughts where they're thinking about killing themselves. I don't understand this. What does this mean? Why would I say that? So these are the things that get sometimes swept under the rug, right? And so that's stuff that needs to be surfaced, and we can do that in safe ways and in healthy ways.
What are those safe ways and healthy ways, for those listening in who probably are identifying with the types of, well, I'm identifying with some of these things that you all are talking about, but what are safe ways for, and particularly young folks, because this is kind of our audience, is to those that are in college or um, trying to get into college, but also addressing, I think all the things that you both described affect people all throughout their entire lives, that juggling. But what are some safe ways, that, and healthy ways can we
Yeah.
address this? Because I feel like a lot of times what ends up happening is, kid is just a scenario, but you go and talk to your parents or like the authority figure in your life, and then they yell at you because of the shame that you all were talking about, and
Yeah.
that just makes the person go inward even more because they're like, well, I'll, I'm not being validated in any way, so why would I ever tell them anything? And then oftentimes it's way too late because we weren't even able to tell them, like, I don't like that color, I don't want to eat this. Like, I don't even know how you go from like that conversation. You can't even tell, not everybody, but a lot of upbringings, like, I can't even tell you I don't like something. Oh, so how would I even get to feelings?
Right. Ofa, what do you think?
I think that's so hard, right? I think as a child in any family, that's a really tough position to be in when you recognize, oh, I have these needs that might need a mental health counselor, and how can I do this in a way that still is respectful to my family? I think just redefining what shame even means, right? I think in our culture, it's like any
Yeah.
little thing that you do is like, oh, that's so shameful. Stop doing that. And then
Yeah.
we're really stopping people just from being authentic, right? Just like someone being themselves could be really shameful. And so I
Right.
think just redefining what shame actually means, because there's so many things that are normal, and the normal for mental illness that's actually not shameful. And so I think as young people, especially when you are taught and raised in a culture that has a lot of stigma around mental illness, I think for young people, just redefining that, oh, I'm actually normal, or this is who I am, or this is my experience, and I can validate my experience and still seek mental health professionals and still respect the relationships in my family all at the same time. There's so many
Ah,
things to balance and to juggle
yeah.
at the same time.
Yes. I love what Ofa's saying about redefining. I I agree 1,000% that that's what we need to do is create a space for yourself to redefine what that experience meant to you or what it means to feel what you feel, and just take a step back, do some writing, journal, write some things down, keep it for yourself, do it in your phone if you need to, as long as nobody else is like knows your password and can go in there, but have it be private, have it be a place, have somewhere where you can write these things down or record it, just your experiences to redefine what this means. And yeah, and somebody just did a little chat on there's a disconnect on language. Let's make sure we get to that, but I the it's critical to give yourself some space so that you can redefine and journal and to have um a place where you actually feel like you're allowed to be authentic, like authentically you. And when you do that for yourself, truly do that for yourself, like self-care, it is so important for us to begin to include ourselves in the equation. Do you know how many Pacific Islanders we have spoken to that come in and they didn't even know that their own self-care should be on their radar? Like, they're so worried and concerned and in their Pacific Islander role about who they are and what their responsibilities are, and that's such a deep part of their identity. But what wasn't in the equation or included in the equation was their own self care and who they are as a person. We need to redefine that and just like Ofa said, and really take a hard look at that. And the other piece we talk about in the Kaimana group is please create a space for yourself, and you can in this group where you actually confront yourself, where you begin to go, wait a minute, I actually believe that that was acceptable at one point, but you start to realign it, and then you look at it and you go, wait a minute, is that in line with what I really truly believe and feel? And check that out. Really check that out. So anyways, those are just some simple things to start off with, Moana, that Ofa and I are talking about. But it looks like you've got some chats coming through that we could help out with. Are there some things there that we need to answer?
I think mentioning some folks are talking about, but when you do try to have these conversations with parents and try to share your feelings, they are saying that you're taumutu or you're talking back. How what kind of tools would you
Yeah,
give to somebody or share?
sure.
What kind of, I don't know, advice would you give to somebody who is experiencing that? Well, there
Yeah,
is
yeah. Yeah, that's beautiful. Uh, Ofa, you want to lead on that?
It's so hard to talk to, it's so hard to navigate these conversations, right? Because it's cultural and there's respect in our culture. And I think in a very respectful way, trying to own your own feelings. And I think being okay that your parents might not be the person to help you with this one thing. And finding a person, if in order for you to navigate these things in a safe way, you have to find a safe person. And it's okay if that safe person is not your ecclesiastical leader or your parent. And I think I think validating that for yourself, but also finding someone that can validate that for you. And oftentimes that is a mental health counselor who is also familiar with Pacific Island culture.
Yeah,
Well,
yeah,
that before you go, Lani, I just wanted to like that safe person. I think you can't what do you call it? You can't stress that enough. That it
yeah,
doesn't necessarily have to be someone of authority. And I think so much of Pacific Islanders or us as like, or me as a Tongan, we have been conditioned that we get validation from these authority figures and mostly our parents, that if they're not saying it's okay, you're okay, when a lot of the trauma that we do have is because they were shaming us for being ourselves. And I think that
yeah.
well, at
That's
least for
right.
my own development of understanding, like that part that you said, Ofa, too, like being okay if they're not that safe person. That
Yeah,
hit me too, because I think for so many we say, "Oh no, that should be my safe person. My parents should," but sometimes they're not.
yeah,
They're not the right person to share your whole
yeah,
truth with.
yeah. In several cases where we've had, and I want to echo what Ofa said, we've actually had, because we've had several teenagers that are like, oh heck no, my safe person is not my mom or my dad. Is that No, that is not the case. But I do happen to have an auntie, or I have a cousin, and they will go to that safe person, or they'll find a way, right? To connect with that safe person. We support that. That it's important for them to really stay connected. We would I had one girl where she would call it her super eight. There were 8 people on the earth that she knew that had her back. And she would go to that super eight. And so we would call that her super eight team. So like if you have your super one or your super two or super three that's on your team, have that be your team, but have it be your network, your go-to, so that it is safe. And the other piece was, we also have had situations where they were really isolated and didn't have access, other than maybe sometimes, because some of them didn't have access to like their own phone. Let's say they had to use their mom or dad's phone, or and it was pretty scary for some of them, and so they didn't know how else to, and who else to talk to. In those cases, because our people are big on Talanoa and storytelling, we would say to the person, ask your parents, and you can even just pick one of them. Mom, or dad, when you told us about this story, like, how old were you? Have them tell you their stories. And then, so when you were my age, what was that like, what did you go through? What high school did you go to? And then, like, who were the people that you were telling us before that was like really big in your life when you were like my age? And what that does is it allows both of you to be able to come to a place where they're like, okay, this is really good. And I love what Dr. Mafileo shared. She said it's like, in the islands when you're going to get the crabs, you don't position and anchor your boat above the crabs, because when they see you coming and they see your shadow, they scatter around and you'll never catch the crabs. But if you know anchor it at a distance, and then you dive in at an angle, which is what this is, they don't see you coming, and then they'll just be there, and then you can grab those crabs. Okay, it's the same thing. So when you that's the metaphor. So when you work with them and you're asking them to tell their stories, they, man, what Pacific Islander parent isn't going to tell you their stories? And when you do
Trick
that,
'em.
yeah. But it begins some sort of a way, if you will, to shift it so that it's not this shame and blame game. It changes the dynamics. I'm listening to your story and I have more questions. Like, I really want to know and understand. That's almost like, wow, they really want to know and understand. So I would definitely start with the storytelling. And we actually had a girl do that where she used to get hit. But when she started asking about the stories, she said the hitting decreased over time and then eventually stopped. So you know what I'm saying? So in terms of being able to get in there in tough situations, typically for our people, the storytelling may truly help.
Would you say that they're defensive because they're dealing with some of their own shame or shortcomings as a parent, that they're shutting down this conversation? What do you say is of like what
I
have you
think that that's I
guys?
think that's a big part of that. I think another part is just they're uncomfortable with talking about emotions, hardships.
Yeah.
That's really vulnerable for people. And so I think
Mhm.
as a parent, oftentimes that could be really uncomfortable. And I think even just the disconnect with the language, like if I'm going to say, I remember in my first year of grad school, I asked my grandpa, has there ever been a time that you felt depressed? And he was like, what? And I was like, like sad or like, extremely sad for like more than
Right.
2 weeks. He was like, no, never. And I was like, you've never felt depressed? And he was like, no. And he kind of just shut that down because he didn't understand. And so what I did, exactly what Lani was saying. So Lani, I love that you brought that up, is that
Thank
I
you.
just asked, okay, well, what was moving to America like for you? And how can
Yes.
you talk about that? How can you talk about
Yes.
that first? Maybe you don't want to use the labels. I think that oftentimes, the big labels are really scary for people. And so they don't
Yes.
want to label that as, oh yeah, that in that time I may have felt depressed or anxious. But he told me like just how hard it was for him to make that transition. And
Yes.
I think just that language, sometimes that disconnect fuels the stigma around mental illness when we're using those words that are tied to mental
Yes.
illness.
Yes. Yes. I agree. And we really have to use words that are relatable to them and make sense to them, because there were certain things that especially with some of our older generation, they're not going to understand. Right. So it's going to need to be language that they understand. Like, what was that like? Exactly what Ofa was saying. What was that like? Or what happened when, and a lot of times we're going off of bits and pieces of other stories that we've heard, right? And so we're trying to dive into it more with them, and typically that's really like, they like that, that they'll respond to that. But super important to connect with the language and connect with the stories. And then and as you do that more and more, I think that will begin to open up some pathways, to really connect.
Thank you. Before I go into questions, if anybody has questions, remember just the Q&A on the bottom, or even the chat box, but drop some in. I have a question though before we transition into that. When, and this is a hard question too, I think, I don't know if, I know you two probably have researched it, but I'm wondering what you found. When is it no longer my responsibility for you to be nice to me or you to I think like the discussion of resiliency, especially in communities of color and in our own Pacific Islander communities and those that are impoverished, like there's a lot of talk of like, oh, they did it themselves and they pulled themselves up, they had such a hard life, and it's kind of, I think it's a detriment in a lot of ways because then we're not allowed to feel pain and hurt. And then shifting that over into families, when you're the oldest or you're the first and you're doing things, you're the expectation of you is to not feel those things, but to we're here, we're talking like we thrive, we have to overcome that, like and then you've done all these techniques that you guys have offered up. When is it just like, I don't want to tauhiwa anymore, I just want to live a good life myself, and I like what would you say is a good time to just like detach? I don't know, even know the word for it, because I feel like even in our language we don't have this idea of maybe motu these people with this family, like there's just it's abuse. Instead of just saying resiliency, it's like manipulation and abuse.
Yeah.
And I think that's the red flag, right? When patterns in relationships are abusive or manipulative, then that's a red flag for me to tune into what I need and then make space for my own needs, for me to meet my own needs. Because we love to give, but what are we going to give if we have nothing left to give, right? And we need to replenish that. And so self-care is really important, but I think oftentimes in our culture, we think in terms of all or nothing. It's like, yes, I'm going to be in this relationship and it's going to thrive and flourish in the way that I was taught, or we're going to be cut off and I'm not going to talk to you for years. And I think just finding that middle ground, because it's not all or nothing. It's almost never all or nothing. And so just finding that middle ground where I can set a boundary and I can choose when I'm going to interact with you, if it's a healthy way, and I can choose when to make space between us, because that's also healthy too. So I think just challenging the thoughts of like just black and white, all or nothing, can sometimes be really helpful, even in our relationships, right? Like it doesn't have to be the relationship that we were taught. Like this is just all or nothing.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm totally with Ofa on that. We live somewhere in the middle, and it's healthier for us to live somewhere in the middle, and that's really our reality most of the time. And um, uh, there's a process called ho'oponopono, right? And that is to restore and to make that which was wrong right, to make it right again. And in that process, when you have, for example, in the islands, and you have a person that's has like even a victim, and if you will, or survivor, together with the offender, what they're entangled due to some of the issues and the problems that are going on. Yet many times the people that are there are actually they care about each other. They don't say it to the judge, they don't say it to everybody else around there, but there is some element of, dang, I actually want to be okay with you. Maybe I don't need to see you every day. In fact, I probably don't want to see you for a while, but I want to set some healthy boundaries around this. And in the Ho'oponopono process, that is the conversation, is to mitigate that, is to figure out what feels right and appropriate. But before you even do that, there needs to be an acknowledgement. And this is where our people really, really need to work on this, is acknowledge what happened. Acknowledge what happened. Do not sweep it under the carpet. Acknowledge what happened. And when we acknowledge what happens is we begin to say, now that we can acknowledge it, we can actually address it in a way that we have a voice to be able to say what that felt like and what was the impact of that choice that person made. And when I'm able to describe how that impacted me and how that impacted my family or impacted those that I love and those that were really affected by that, there's power in that. Because when you move from acknowledgement and you move through that pattern of healthy expressions of being able to say how you were impacted, that is the beginning of the healing. We cannot heal and pretend at the same time. It doesn't work like that in the universe. We can't heal and pretend at the same time. Doesn't work. So we really have to acknowledge it, and we really have to surface it and have that come out to where and let it emerge to where we now are like, I'm clear now about what we're dealing with, and I'm going to let you know how this really impacted me and affected me. And I think when an offender, for example, begins to hear on a deeper level, and my argument has been with the state and for like juvenile justice and even for Department of Child and Family Services, for which I worked for a long time, is that if you're going to do a victim letter, I mean, that's okay. But I don't think it really does it justice in terms of what the real deep impact was. Like to actually have a process where you actually do that. In our culture, we have specific ways of healing that are much deeper than a victim letter. Now, there are situations where a victim letter would be correct and it'd be appropriate, but like in a lot of ways, even like the survivor and victim wants closure on this, but it has to be acknowledged. So on a simpler level that you were talking about, Ofa, it is being in the middle, like what I mean, that Ofa was talking about, being in the middle and not having it be so black and white. If you think about it on a simpler level, Moana, where you acknowledge what happened. Why am I feeling this way that I don't want to tauhiva anymore? There's a reason why you don't want to tauhiva anymore. We need to acknowledge what that is and identify it.
And that's
When
me acknowledging. It's not necessarily the offender acknowledging.
correct, that's
So,
correct.
or even the parental or authority figure in the life acknowledging that something happened to me. That's
Yes,
just me acknowledging, right?
yes, and that happens a lot in our culture.
Mm.
Is that it's the at some point the survivor needs to be able to acknowledge. That's the first piece. Now, if we're in a situation where the person has passed away and they're the ones that are, and it's gone to the grave with them, but we need healing, I don't believe in opening up a can of worms unless it's impacting us in the present tense. If it's affecting us in the present tense, it needs to be dealt with then. And there's a book called Feelings Buried Alive Never Die by Carol K. Truman, Carol with a K, Carol K. Truman. That is so spot on. Feelings buried alive never die. They keep resurrecting. But then when we have closure on it and we really work on it, once they get buried, they stay buried because there's closure. And so it's really important to go through and allow ourselves to go through the process. But you don't necessarily always have to have the person that you feel angst towards be there. Sometimes it's something that you can do yourself, just like what Ofa was saying. You can talk to a person you feel safe with, you can talk to a therapist. There are other avenues to do that, but there are very important ways by which to handle that.
Thank you. We're going to move into a couple of questions that were asked anonymously. One of our viewers said, a few years ago, my cousin told me she had a plan to kill herself. She went through a lot that year, and I knew she was having a hard time. But when she told me she had a plan, I knew she was serious. I met with her and we talked, but I felt so unequipped to help her. It was a tough convo to have because she was so set on doing it. At the end of it, she decided she wasn't going to, and we planned together to help. We made a plan together to help her. My question is, what resources are there that can help with emergency situations like this?
Yep. Okay. Ofa, you want to?
Yeah. So resources, first of all, I think it's really, it was probably really helpful for your cousin, for you to be there and for you to be that safe person as we're talking about safe people. That's huge. And I think there's something in that relationship that made her feel safe enough to come to you and confide about suicidal ideation. Sometimes I think the misconception is if we bring up suicidal, like if we follow up on that it might make that person even more suicidal. But no, talking about it actually helps to like pacify the problems, and it actually really helps just to say it out loud to someone who can be there and who can understand and provide empathy. And so that's really helpful. And I think that I think it's important to acknowledge that you just being there for that person can make all the difference. Some resources, I know that like I'm just familiar with the resources at BYU. We have after hours phone calls through the BYU police. I'm sure that the University of Utah has a similar like emergency person to call.
Yes.
So I think contacting the university police to talk to a clinician that is on call. There will always be at any time, any day of the year, there will always be someone on call for an emergency.
And look out on our follow us on our page. We're gonna be providing those resources for the University of Utah and for OFA at BYU, and then community resources from Lani. So go ahead, OFA. Sorry.
And then another option is if you are or your cousin is not comfortable talking over the phone, then just texting. And I know that Utah has a service through 741-741. And it's just if you just need to text someone and you just are not comfortable talking over the phone, then that is a good resource too.
That's great. That's great. Another resource, and I ditto that. I think it was really important that you were there for your cousin. I think the other piece too is we deal with something in our field called secondary trauma. And secondary trauma is when the helper feels traumatized by what they just went through. So please don't think it's abnormal for you after you helped your cousin to feel like you're shaking and that you're like, holy cow, I think I need help too. That's normal. Please know that that is normal. And that's called secondary trauma. So there's a name for it too. So please get help too. I just can't even stress that enough. People who are out there helping others, they need help too and support. So please know that that's normal. Please upload what we call the SAFE, SAFEUT. So the SAFEUT app. So just upload SAFEUT app.
So the Safe Utah app.
Yep, Safe UT app. Upload it, and just like Ofa was saying, you can text them or you can call them, and it's 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The other piece too that I really like on it, because I've got it on my phone, is that you can actually, there's like 4 little buttons on there. One of the buttons is also for you to actually give a tip. So if you see a situation where someone's being bullied and you're like, I don't even know who to tell, or there was a situation where there was a Polynesian kid that was being hit in a parking lot by an adult, but like severe, and people don't know where to call right at that moment. You can actually go right into Safe UT app, hit that little button, and you can just give a tip, and then they'll make sure to call and help whoever right at that moment. The main number for Safe UT, just in case you want it, besides the Safe UT app, their contact number is 833-372-3388. That's 833-372-3388. So that's actually 833 3, Safe UT. So those are some resources to use, and that's 24/7 with a licensed therapist right there, anytime, any day, and you can even give tips. So, and again, for secondary trauma, make sure you get the help too, for as you were helping your cousin, in case you need it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lani. Also, I just want to say that it's important for young people to understand that it's okay to refer to a professional, and it's okay that, and listening and being there is really important. And then when you know that you can't do any more for this person's safety, then please refer. Thank you, Lani.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you, Alpha.
Part of that is there any way, along with that question, is there any way to prepare for the conversations like these? You both kind of talked about this, but fully answering it is, how do you prepare for conversations like this if it happens again? Referring them, of course, and all the things that you talked about, but is there anything like I don't know, even me, like it's uncomfortable, and all of us are, majority of us were not raised with having these difficult conversations. So how are we? How do we prepare?
Go ahead, Alpha.
It's hard to prepare for conversations like this, and I think even just asking, like, how serious are you feeling? Do you have a plan? What can I do for you? What can I do for you right here? What do you need from me? I think that oftentimes when we are offering support, we assume that we know. We're offering support in the way that we know how. And so I think asking the person, so in this situation would be the cousin, asking the cousin, what kind of support do you need from me right now? And help me to understand that, so that I'm not assuming.
Yeah.
I think just always having that, anytime anyone is bringing up any mental health issues, I think just asking, what kind of support do you need from me?
Yeah. Yeah. I really like that, because I think it is really hard. And I think maybe what would be helpful to the audience is words like what Ofa was saying. How can I be of support to you? What can I do to help? What I like about that, and what I think as well, is that it needs to be simple. One of the most important pieces that I think can happen, and what we need to do is be clear about this, is people start to feel responsible. Let me just say the elephant in the room. It is not your responsibility if something happens. Now, because people, and it's all over the literature, if someone is determined to actually commit suicide, the literature has demonstrated over and over and over again, they will do it with or without you, with or without me, with or without us, if they are determined. Now, in terms of saying, I would like to be able to help and get them resources and be there for them as much as I can, and love them. I'm always going to love them, pray for them. I'll be there for them. I'll do what I can. Absolutely. Beautiful. That's beautiful. But we've got to be careful about stepping over that line, and then any of us in the audience feeling like, oh my gosh, they did kill myself. That's called survivor's remorse. That's the name of it. And there are people that have come to therapy many times over the years because of survivor's remorse. And what they didn't realize was that when someone is determined to do that, they will, it's not so much about, you could have said something, or you didn't say the right words at the right time, or you weren't up at 3 a.m. when they were actually going to follow through with their plan. That's not on you. What you can do in the moment is, like, call these numbers, or get to that resource. Beautiful. Or just listen to them. But in the middle of all of that, it comes down to each person having a choice. Now, the exception to that are young children or someone who actually does not have the capacity to make a decision. Or let's say if they have Alzheimer's, okay? You know what? At that point, we got to get the police involved in, we got to make sure that because they don't have the capacity. But if we have somebody and we did everything that we could in terms of getting them to a resource, and God forbid, but that night after we get off the phone with them, and believe me, I've been in this for a long time and I'm a grandma. It's horrifying. I've had 2 young people on my caseload from DCFS die. And it's awful. It's an awful piece because I have felt, survivor's remorse. But I've had to go through my own processing of that's what they were going to do that. And so let's get the resource to them the best we can, but we've got to separate and delineate that line between what's mine and what's yours, and just do the best that you can. But please be careful of that, because we can really get wrapped up in that, and it can take up so much of who you are and your energy. You got to be really careful of that.
Yeah. And as again, what we're talking about, Pacific Islanders, we already have a sense that we were supposed to help. And then
Yeah.
so thank you for sharing that. Our next question, and we have the privilege of both of you being here, but I've often thought about this too, that there's only 2 of you. And I, because of anonymity, you 2 can't be my therapist, right? So one of the questions are there programs out there that can help and assist with Ho'oponopono process or to facilitate locally that aren't necessarily the both of you?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, we have a program, the Kaimana group, that runs with or without me. That's what we created, but it's an entity of its own. And we have a book that's going to come out in January. We're hoping that it's going to come out on, who we're working with is Amazon. So it'll be on Amazon Kindle. So you can either do an ebook or you can get the hard book. But the group Kaimana and addressing the Ho'oponopono, and then making those connections, we do have access to those. So yes, through the Kaimana group. So what I'll give to Moana is our website, which is www.childandfamilyempowerment.com. And the "and" is spelled out. So it's childandfamilyempowerment.com. Just go on there. You can reach us, and our next groups, Soa Mulitalo is my assistant, and she's working with us. And then we have the Kaimana cultural consultants that are in training right now to become cultural consultants. They're being certified. We're going to run some more groups in March, in the spring, and again in summer. So if you're interested, just let us know. We'll get you connected to those resources and whatever OFA has. Yeah.
No, I love what you're doing, Lani. That's the work in the community, and I wish that that I could serve the community in that way. And so I love the programs that you've set up. You're a trailblazer for our Pacific Island community here. I'm always looking for referrals. There are some Pacific Islanders here, local, but I'm always looking for referrals, and I feel like I'm still always struggling to get referrals.
Yeah, we'll stay in touch. For sure.
Referrals for can you clarify that?
Yeah, referrals to refer for Pacific Island
students,
therapists.
Oh, therapists. Yeah, I think what would be helpful for a lot of folks, and this is not to put the onus on you too. I know you have a lot of work, but it would be awesome too if you all did know of like a database or something that we could look at. For me, just all the things you all talked about, when I'm looking for a therapist, it's difficult because then I do spend a lot of time explaining all of these things. And then after, I'm like, well, my law for that 1 hour I paid you for me to talk to myself. And I just think that probably for this next generation, that the demand now is high,
Mm-hmm.
but you all only can fill so many seats, and you know so many people, right? So I think one of the questions that I have that might be lingering for other folks is, how do both of you um, navigate, negotiate, because the Tongan and Pacific Islander community is so small, and you're servicing, you're providing a service for folks, right? How do you balance that, the anonymity piece as well as disclosure? I would love to hear that as like some of our final thoughts.
Yeah, I actually, so in school, I learned that multiple relationships are not always healthy as a therapist. But I feel like with our Pacific Island community, especially if they are a student at BYU and they request a Pacific Island counselor, usually they will know if they know me, right? So, and I think that I've seen it helpful that we might know, we might not be in the same, like we're not in the same circles, right? So it's not my best friend that's coming over to see me for therapy. But even if they're from the same community, of like the same Pacific Island community here in Utah, but also even from Hawaii, students at BYU, if they are okay with it and if they see value in meeting with someone that's from the same similar background, then I am okay with having that therapeutic relationship, because I don't actually have a relationship with them outside. And I think this is one of the areas that needs more research too, right? That how can a multiple relationship in therapy be really helpful for communities like this? And I know that there have been researchers that studies done in small town communities where if you have to drive 100 miles to see the next therapist, then sometimes you can't avoid that multiple relationship. So I've seen it be really helpful for our community. Although I know that there are some limitations to that, because I won't just meet with anybody that I know in
Yeah,
my life. Yeah.
that makes
Yeah.
sense.
Yeah. Yeah, that's something that we constantly have to navigate, right, Ofa? So I'm definitely of the same vein. I honestly, I'm like, there's only like a few of us, so I'm not gonna like, no, you can't, just not gonna do that, not unless it's like my own niece or something. Somebody that's just so close that would be a conflict of interest, then I'll definitely refer them. But by and large, we've been able to work together because, like, I know, um, Ofa out there, and Kavika and Alan, right? Professor Allen. And then in south of the valley, in terms of the Salt Lake Valley, we have Eddie Vakauta, who's at LCSW. And we have the Molenis, right? Several of them are LCSWs. We also have several that are in pockets of other agencies. So maybe they're like earning their hours, but then they'll become fully licensed. So it's not like we don't have Pacific Islander therapists. There are maybe for sure more here than in other states, but we refer to each other. And so if we if if I know somebody in Utah County, for sure I'll send them down to where Ofa and Professor Allen are. If they're up here in Salt Lake County, I will make sure to refer to any, and they'll refer to me as well. Like, there is that exchange. I know in terms of putting something together that was actually worked on by what's his first name? I can't remember, but it was Kini Kini. He's in Utah County, but he was working on putting like a directory together, right? So I think that's something that could be followed up with. And I'm constantly saying to my clients, Pacific Islander or not, if you see me in the store, because this is a small community, and you don't say hi to me, I won't say hi to you, and I'll just keep walking. If you say hi to me, I'll know that that's my signal that you're okay if I say hi back to you. Now, if I have any of my, family here with me, or, close friends, and they go, "Who's that?" I'll just say, "Oh, it's just someone I know." And, I'll keep it like that. And I'll explain that to them. They're like, "Okay, all right, that's cool." So we do set up parameters like that ahead of time as well.
That's great to know. Our
Yeah.
final question in our last few minutes, and I don't want to take more time than necessary with you all, is a really good one. With the untimely deaths right now and the inability to grieve largely with others in physical proximity, do you all have recommendations of things we can do for ourselves to help with the grieving process and ways that we can recenter, especially with the exhaustion of all these things around us: pandemic, racial unrest, the election, which will let you all go by 7 to see what happens. I'm unrest too.
It was heading in a good direction before this webinar, so I pray that it's continuing.
So what recommendations do you have? It's such a good question in a sense. Like there have been so many deaths with COVID, and yes, I want to go through this putu, but I also want to not to be alive after as well,
Yeah.
You can go
Ofa?
first, Lani.
Lani,
Okay.
go ahead, Lani.
Okay. I honestly, um, okay, we've been working with a lot of families that are dealing with the COVID right now. And I can tell you that the most important thing for right now, okay, first, safety. That's going to be the top piece, is safety. Safety for yourself, safety for your family, safety for those around you and those, your loved ones. So if you will make sure that those safety parameters are set up so that, you know, you're doing all the right things you need to do, mask up whenever, you're going outside. If you're in the house with a bunch of people for whatever reason, and you feel like you need to be able to mask even at home, because sometimes there's multiple people, you got to be able to talk about that and be okay with that. Using hand sanitizer, and of course, as much as you can, social distance. um, as you do the safety, and we have a lot of Pacific Islanders where they've been coming in and out of the hospitals, and the Pacific Islanders per capita, from what we understand, are one of the highest, if not the highest, right here locally, that have had COVID and have passed and are passing away from COVID. So safety I can't even express how critical it is at this point. In terms of our own well-being, um, do you remember how we were talking or speaking earlier about Tauhiva? So this is the time, to what we've done, and is, I know that this is a simple thing, and I don't mean to embarrass my husband or my person from my staff, but like, we can't go out and mingle around with everybody. But you know what? He made some herbal tea and stuff for them to drink to help with like congestion because they were sick. We dropped it off on their porch, and then we just called them and texted them and said, "It's on your porch. Let us know if that works for you. Hope that helps," right? And they do the same for other people. So it's important to not forget who we are. You can still tauhiva. You can still do it in safe ways. Be true to who you are and to your culture and yourself. And I would say, please, journal and write an account, like even in your phones, of what you're doing. Take pictures. The reason why is because you're witnessing to yourself what you are experiencing, and you're validating who you are and that you exist and that you're important. And so, Ofalahiatu, love you guys. Please take good care of yourself. That's how you could do it.
Yeah, I love all those things that Lani said. I think slowing down is really important right now. We all have responsibilities and we're really busy. And I think in times of grief, it could be really common to avoid the pain of the grief that we're feeling, of the difficult emotions that we have. And so I think just slowing down and tuning in to our own bodies. And then going along with what Lani said, finding other ways that are safe to still connect with people. Sometimes a phone call, FaceTime, you're still connecting with them. And this is a worldwide pandemic, right? So we're not the only ones that are, and you're not making this up too. This is the world right now. And so even though we want to hold strong to the cultural values and practices that we have, it's also important to take care of ourselves. And this is just one of the ways that we can take care of ourselves.
Yeah. And everything that Ofa said, and Juana, by you guys doing this webinar, you guys are doing it too. So, you guys are in it. You guys are doing such a great job. So thank you for doing this too and holding this.
Thank you both. We're at the top of the hour here. I wanted to just thank both of you for taking your precious time to work with us and talk with us. It's so important, the work that you're both doing. I think as a commitment for myself with the passing of Rita, I've been reaching out to all of my friends and activists and community workers and just realizing to thank them and talk to them while they're still alive, and tell them like, thank you for all the work that you all are doing now. I just can't emphasize that enough. Thank you both for um, I think I'll get emotional about it, but thank you both for in a lot of ways taking the hit, for being the forerunners of a lot of this the mental health conversations that are happening, and being willing and vulnerable yourselves to share your own stories as you figure out how to lay the foreground for the rest of us. It's a lot easier when you recognize that, okay, it's not just me feeling this way. There's a lot of other people that are experiencing this type of anguish or feeling alone right now in the pandemic. And then knowing that there are experts out there that can help you and direct you to a place. They're experts, but are very down to earth and approachable. So I thank you both for the work that you're doing, not just professionally, but for the community as well. So thank you for joining
Malo,
us.
Malo, thank you.
So I just want to close out everyone that is joining us this tonight, to thank all of our contributors, the Bridge team, the School of Transform, and then the School of Education, especially Education, Culture, and Society, with Dr. Ron there, our advisor, faculty advisor. Next week, as you can see, we'll be having, or in 2 weeks, we'll have our next episode, which is more based on resources for students. Follow us on Instagram. Oh, and I forgot to put a plug in for at Dr. Ofa on Instagram. If you're looking for some information, she always posts a lot of gems on that. So go follow her as well. And then we've put in the chat all of the different numbers, and as well as Lani's website. So if you all are interested in that, we've recorded this. So if you want to refer back, follow us at Pasifika Scholars and Pasifika Archives online. Thank you so much. Make sure to subscribe. Malo apito.
Malo, Pito.
Doa ofatu.
Ofatu.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Thank you.